Welcome back to Happy Snapping, the podcast where we talk to inspiring and creative individuals in the photography world. I'm your host, James. Thanks for joining. It has been a while since we last checked in, and there's a lot to go over. But before we get into that, our guest today that I'm going to be talking with, his name is Ed. He has an awesome blog detailing all different aspects of photography, from a lens database for infrared nerds to infrared photography to old digital cameras like what I'm into, and some other projects. And I've stumbled across his blog. That was how I first met him, and then found out he also watched this YouTube channel. So we connected over that, and we have a great discussion about infrared photography, bokeh panoramas, and all sorts of other things. So it's a really fun conversation. But before we get into that conversation, let me answer some questions that have come up on the YouTube channel recently, and also give you a sneak peek about some projects that I've been working on and upcoming videos that you should expect on the channel. So the first question comes from Molly BD Num. And they left a comment on a video I made about the Sony QX1. It's not a full-length video, it's just a YouTube short or Instagram reel about this cool camera. So this is coming up. I'm going to be making a full video about this camera soon. But they were asking, saying that they are an Olympus Air owner. So if you don't know about the Olympus Air, it's a similar concept to this. So it's a little cylinder-shaped camera that just has a shutter button and like one other button and the sensor, and you can attach lenses, the Micro Four Thirds lenses to, and then you connect to it via an app through your smartphone. So very similar to this Sony QX1 concept. And they were asking for some more detail about how practical of a shooting experience the QX1 really is. So that'll be explained in more detail in my full video about this camera when that comes up soon, hopefully. But I will say it is more practical than the Olympus Air, because the Olympus Air, their app lost support a long time ago. So you can only use it if you bootload the app. You can use it without the app, but then you have no control over the camera. The Sony, however, still works with their current Sony app that controls other cameras. So amazing that they've kept up support of that. That's a huge deal with these. And also, just as a short sneak peek, there is another way to use this with a screen without an app, without a smartphone. So I'll be showing that in the video as well. I've also gotten a lot of great comments about my transparent Pentax K1, which, what an awesome find. I'm glad that you all enjoyed it as much as I did, because obviously it was expensive to buy. Not as expensive as you think, though. I got a really good deal on it, in my opinion. Anyway, but just an amazing camera. And as a Pentax lover, someone who really likes the K1 especially, this just seemed like something that was in my wheelhouse. And I'm glad you all enjoyed it as well. So I got a lot of great feedback on that video. I was concerned about UV light damaging the electronics. Many people pointed out that the electronics themselves should be fine. It's the plastic on the camera that will yellow with exposure to light, which I hadn't thought of. And actually, it's kind of hard to see on a camera, but there is more yellowing on the side panels than there is on the top. So I don't know what that means about how it was stored originally. Right now, I'm just keeping it in my room. I guess it gets some sun through the window. Anyway, so we'll figure out how to keep that looking nice. And I don't know, I do like collecting cameras, but all the cameras I collect, I actually use. So I don't know if that means I send this to somebody else that wants to just keep it on a shelf and look pretty, or if that just means I use it and it yellows anyway, and it just becomes a cool camera. Or if that would really hurt someone's feelings to kind of ruin it that way. I don't know. Anyway, with all that, let's dive into the conversation with Ed. Could you, for the audience here, just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks very much, James, for having me on the podcast. It's really awesome. I'm a huge fan of your videos.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, and your photography. I really like it. I've been a video game artist now for about 20 years. So I've moved around a little bit for different jobs in the games industry. UK, Amsterdam, and now Sweden, London before that. So sort of back and forth. So my technical role is a world artist, which is very strange. Usually you're sort of classified as like you're a 3D artist, you're senior or junior or whatever. World artist is kind of oddly specific, and that's sort of bred out of like how many racing games that I've done. Everything has been sort of terrain focused. My focus right now in the Frostbite engine for EA is also terrain. I think photography has always been like a form of escapism for me. It's something that I really enjoy doing that isn't like work, although some of the work related thing has kind of come back into photography because I've been into it. So, for example, I got my first digital camera in about 2000, which was my first year in the games industry. And it was when digital was kind of taking off. I had been into photography a little bit before that. Like growing up, my dad always had Pentax cameras. I know you're a big fan of Pentax.
Yes.
So I thought I have to mention that.
Nice.
So like I grew up using the Pentax MX, for example.
Excellent camera.
Which I've got there.
Oh, nice.
Not that exact one, because the one that my dad had was silver. But over the years, the light meter failed.
Yeah.
So I ended up getting the black one because it had a working light meter. And just to sort of remind myself what it was like to use, it is still really nice. Funny enough, it has a bigger viewfinder than even the Sony A1, which I sort of use for wildlife photography now.
And it is it is such a compact, for people who don't know or have held one, it is such a compact SLR camera. And so, that super big, bright viewfinder is surprising.
Yeah, it's kind of a contradiction, right? Because you like, everything's compact, everything's made to be as small as possible. And then you look at the viewfinder and you're like, whoa.
Yeah.
So, and like a lot of the videos that I've seen of yours have made me want to buy cameras. I can totally imagine people watching this be like, Pentax MX, huh? I mean, it's a relatively famous camera anyway. I grew up using the Pentax MX, awesome little camera. But then when I went to college, the college camera that they had was the K1000.
Oh, yeah.
I know a lot of people kind of share that experience. It seems like it was the college camera. Yeah. I actually looked it up, and the production date for the K1000 was 1976 to 1997.
Wow.
Which is way more than like the Pentax MX was. That was relatively short by comparison. Yeah. And I think a lot of that was because people were using them in schools and stuff.
Right. And what's funny about it too is, like, at least over here, the K1000, I think just because it's like that well-known camera will sometimes be more expensive than just buying an MX, which is like such a better featured camera, has a better viewfinder. Like if you search on eBay, not all the time, but I'll see K1000s here selling for like super high, which is a cool camera. I have one up there actually, but nice. Like if you could get an MX, just go that route.
It's funny, isn't it? Because a lot of that comes down to hype, right? If people are talking about it right now, it'll be, fetching higher prices. The MX has, like, people talk about it every now and again, and the prices will go up. But like you say, it can drop below, and it's kind of crazy because it is basically the same as the K1000, but smaller and kind of better. I think it has a couple extra features, which in film cameras, there wasn't a lot in features that in those days, right? But it's a really nice little machine. I ended up sticking to Pentax, like even sort of in my university days. Like I went out and I actually bought my first camera, and that was the Pentax MZ5. So I wanted to stay Pentax the whole time. But when it drifted onto digital, Pentax were very, very slow to adopt. So I wanted to stay Pentax, but I was like, I want a digital camera, but you don't make one. Like you're making me choose somebody else. I felt so betrayed.
Yeah.
So I had to pick something else. So I picked Fuji. So I picked this tiny little, it looks like a bridge camera. I don't know if it was described as a bridge camera back in those days, but it was like a little digital camera that was, had a 6 times optical zoom or something like that. I hated it. At the time. I've bought it again since, just to remind myself what it's like.
Yeah.
It's not a nice camera to use.
What did you not like about it?
It's very, very slow.
Yeah.
I mean, the sensor is very small. You kind of feel that with the quality.
Yeah.
I think the optical lens is probably okay.
But you just would never know.
And another weird thing about it is it did video. And like not all cameras have done video since then, right? It became a thing at the beginning because I think they thought we can. And I think a lot of those early sensors were built for video anyway.
Right. They were really just, the images were really just like stills of video. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. The formats were horrible, like motion JPEGs or something like that. So it did video, but like I think I took 1 or 2 videos with it. I actually went back and looked at my old files and was like, I tried it. It didn't look great, and then I kind of gave up.
Well, that's frustrating too. I mean, a lot of people, I was kind of young back then, and so I don't remember all that transition, and I wasn't super big into photography anyway, as much. But I think a lot of people felt that same sentiment with early digital, because the quality just wasn't there, and and then you were paying actually like quite a bit to get into it for something that like was like just not as good in many ways.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, like I remember it cost me about £700, I think, for the Fuji, and a very small, very kind of poor quality camera, compared to like 150 from my Pentax. What did I have at the time? Oh, another Pentax I had was the P30N, I think it was.
Okay, yeah, I know what you're talking about.
That was the first one that I had bought for me. So when I went to college and I was like, I need my own camera because I don't want to keep using the K1000, even though actually in hindsight it was better. So my dad bought me a P30, and that ended up being my first camera. But when I went to university, I bought my own for myself, and that ended up being the MZ5. And I really like the MZ autofocus cameras. Like I ended up going back and buying an MZ3 recently. And again, really nice, really small, a bit on the light plasticky side. It feels like it'll shatter if you drop it from like 5 centimeters or something. But if it works, it's really a nice camera to use. But that was my last foray into Pentax. When I bought the Fuji in the first year of my job, part of the reason that sort of brought me back into photography, because I hadn't really dabbled in photography before that, was that I was making 3D models for my job. And part of the thing that you kind of really need is 3D textures. And back in the day, there weren't that many good 3D textures online. So I bought a camera thinking I'll make my own. And I ended up being kind of disappointed with the camera. Thought kind of got lost. But I really, really wanted to get like an SLR. So when the Fuji S2 Pro came out, I like spent like all of my money buying that camera, and absolutely loved it. Like that was the first time I think that my interest in photography just really shot up, and I just used it like all the time. And because those cameras, as you know, because I've seen you've done the review on it, uses Nikon lenses, that then took me into Nikon cameras. I wanted to be Pentax still by that point. I was like, come on, Pentax, you can do it. Bring out a digital camera. But no, they were still a little bit behind then. So by the time I was onto Fuji and then onto Nikon cameras, I was kind of just too far away from Pentax at that point. I had like a few prime lenses for the Pentax. For the Nikon at that point. I think I had a Nikon D2H that I upgraded to in a few more years. And that was it. That was me. I was like, I love Nikon at that point.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with Nikon. I actually do have that's the wrong camera. My camera's over. Well, I can't move it easily. But yeah, I have a S2 Pro up there. Yeah, I think there is something to do with having like a proper DSLR or SLR where you can like play with shutter speed and stuff. Because my first camera that was like a really, not just a family camera, was a Canon point and shoot, which I eventually learned. I don't know if you know about this, but there's something called CHDK, the Canon Hack Development Kit. It's kind of this like little ground roots project you can get like manual access on fully automatic Canon point and shoot cameras. You can upload scripts to them and to do random things and stuff. So pretty cool. So I experimented with that, but it was really like cumbersome to change the shutter speed that way. You had to like dive into this dev menu and do stuff. Okay. So my first DSLR was such a big, like, I just loved it. So same kind of experience as you, just like really got me into photography because I could just change something and see what happened. And I had all the controls right there and it just felt unstoppable. It was a little, it was like a 10 megapixel. It was a Pentax. That's what got me into Pentax. Was my uncle was into Pentax and he bought me it was the K2, and so that's what got me. So like once you start in a system, it's the same way. Yeah, you get lenses and then you're just like kind of locked in.
Yeah.
That's
how they get you.
Yeah, they do.
You get the lenses, you like the lenses. they're expensive, and then
Right.
you're kind of stuck.
Yeah.
I mean, I say that like we're sat here with an absolute ton of cameras, right?
Right.
I mean, since then I've
Yeah.
used like tons of Fuji, tons of Canon, tons of Nikon, tons of Sony. Like in a way, I'd like to think that I'm not a fanboy, but I can't say that. I can't say that because of my love for Pentax. Um, I'm kind of racing ahead into sort of like into present day here, but like Sony, I love Sony from a certain perspective, right? But I don't love it for like how they feel. I don't love it for the controls that they have. It just doesn't have that same kind of feeling. Like I've had Fuji X100. It's one of the ones in the display cabinet there.
Nice.
And yeah, I mean, like you use that, and it's like, yes, this is what I remember from the days of mechanical dials. Like it
Yeah.
reminds you of all of that stuff, and it just inspires part of you to go out and take images. I don't get that with Sony. Like Sony for me is purely like I just want to accomplish something, and I know it can, so it gets me what I want. But I always wish I could kind of combine lots of different things from lots of different cameras, but yeah, you can't.
Well, and sometimes I wonder if that would even be that much better. I was talking to David, the CEO of Pixie, earlier, and he was talking about how people get super excited because he's making cameras. So then they'll come to him and they'll be like, "Hey, add this, add this, add this." So he's like, "If I actually added all of that, we would get a
Yeah.
camera nobody wanted. Like it would it would do all these things and do nothing well." So I do like, not that I don't think like I have way too many cameras. I don't think people need to have 14 cameras or whatever, but I do think even like 2 cameras, because then you can have one that like is really good at getting this particular task done, and then
Yeah.
one that you kind of throw around when you need you're burnt out and you need some inspiration or something. And I do think that those can be 2 separate cameras, and maybe ideally still are.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think you're probably right. I think they probably do need to be fundamentally different devices to get that emotion out of you. But yeah, it doesn't stop me collecting many different cameras. What about you? Like, what would you say is the camera that excites you the most currently?
That's a really good question. It always seems to come back to some older DSLRs. So I do play with lots of cameras, and for like weeks at a time, they'll be really exciting and fun. And I share a lot about those on the channel, but it seems to always like the ones that really click with me. I almost wonder if it's just because it's like pulling me back to the time when I was most excited about photography as a young teenager with a DSLR for the first time. And I just like, everything was so cool. So I wonder if it just pulls me back into that. But yeah, so older DSLRs, I think. And then right now I have the ones I'm playing with. I have the S2 Pro. I'm still shooting with that and enjoying that and playing with that. I have a Olympus E1 now. I traded out my Olympus E300, so a little 4/3 DSLR. And then
nice.
Yeah, and then if I love my Pentax K1, so if that actually, going back to what you said, that to me, because I don't need like super blazing fast autofocus, that to me feels like a camera that is both like I can just do whatever I want with it and actually does feel inspiring to me, like I like to shoot with.
It's funny because back in the day, the Pentax K1 would have been exactly what I wanted. Because it's full frame, because it's Pentax, because it's digital. If that had been out at an earlier time,
way earlier,
I probably wouldn't have been able to afford it, but I would have wanted it.
Yeah, it is wild to think about how long it took them to get that out. And it's just, I think I mean, I love the camera itself, but I think for Pentax, the company, it was like too long, too late. Like you just lost so many people that probably would have hopped on your system.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be one on my radar of one I want to pick up at some point, because I just want to see what it's like to use it.
Yeah, you should
at this point.
Yeah.
But another one that you picked up recently is the one we actually connected to over, which was the Kodak DCS, which again, I put in the background there for anyone watching YouTube. But yeah, I really love using that camera. It is a brick. What is it? Nearly 2 kilograms without a lens.
Yeah, something like that. It is heavy.
But there's something about it that's really fun to use. It's CCD, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they did stick with CCD on that one, and was a Kodak made one, which is interesting. I just talked again on my channel about the Pro 14N, which was their first full frame, which actually then the sensor wasn't made by Kodak, and then it was CMOS, which was interesting.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so that was, and then it's APS-H, which I just think is interesting. Like there's probably, I haven't made a list, but there's not like that many APS-H cameras ever made.
No, I have to say, like, because the first sort of old DSLR I went back to was the Nikon D1, and I was just lucky with that one. I think that's really what sparked my interest going back and picking up older cameras again. And when I was a student and I got the Fuji, was it 6900Z, the little bridge camera, that was what I wanted. I wanted a Nikon D1, but it was like £5,000 or dollars at the time. I couldn't afford that. That was just insane. And then, of course, you would have had to put lenses on it. So it was always like something that I held up, on this pedestal as a kid at the time. It's like, oh, I wish I could have that camera. So then when one came up on an auction, and it was relatively cheap, very good condition, which is actually quite difficult to get now. Not cheap, but the good condition is kind of rare, because they tended to be used by professionals and they tended to be a little bit battered. But yeah, I got it and it worked. And I was like, wow, this is super, super cool. So I think that's the one that really sparked it for me. And then later on, I found the Kodak. But because I've been so used to full frame, purely from the lenses that I have with Nikon, it was difficult to go to the D1 and kind of be satisfied in that regard. And I feel like the DCS 760 completely took that edge off for me. The lenses were close enough that you could use a 50 and it didn't feel too far off, or you could use a 28 and it didn't feel too constrictive. So I totally understand where they were coming from, but I also understand why they didn't win against the D1, right? It's so much more visualized camera. I mean, it was effectively like a Nikon F5, right? It looked like a purpose-built camera because it was. And
instead of like cobbled together.
Yeah, but then equally, that's kind of the charm of the DCS 760 now.
For me it is, yeah.
Because the sound of that mirror slap on the F5 is just phenomenal.
Yeah.
So to have that with like image quality that's relatively decent, 6 megapixels is kind of okay.
Yeah, I agree. It's really all about the older cameras. It's really all about just like getting the lighting exactly how you want, so you don't have to touch anything in post. Yeah. And then 6 megapixels is nice. Like on it, people would not notice.
No.
Otherwise, especially in the formats we publish today.
Like especially Instagram. And I've put things on my website like high res, and it stands up next to anything else, to be honest with you. The resolution for web is fine, even high-end web.
Yeah. So that is actually, it is funny you mentioned that, because that is how I first came across your work and before we even connected, I had no idea that you had seen my channel before, but if you Google Kodak DCS 760, you're like the first review that pops up, the first website that pops up. And it was, I guess, okay, DP Review just beat you. I just watched it. I just clicked on it just now, but you're right under DP Review. And
wow.
Yeah. And
that's quite shocking.
So it was just super helpful stuff you had on here. I can't remember exactly. There was one part you had that like no one else talked about.
Okay.
I don't remember what it was. You talked about the battery situation, which is helpful because you got to be really careful with that.
Yeah. I had read someone else's review about that, and they bought theirs without any charger, because you can get it with the wall charger and then you can get it with the battery charger. And if you get it with neither, it can be really difficult to get it working, because I think there was one third-party charger, battery charger, but that's probably even rarer than the original. So yeah, it can be really problematic. The batteries are pretty easy to source. I think you mentioned, right, there's like one.
Yeah, there's some sellers still selling them. I don't know if they make them or if they're just super old stock or something, but they're out there. And then I just published my Kodak DCS 14N video. Those batteries I can't find anywhere. Somebody said they did see one somewhere, but then a lot of people have commented and say, "Oh, just take it apart and replace the cells," which is well beyond like what I know how to do.
Ooh,
it gives me hopes that that's potentially something you could do is pull them out, and as long as there's some standard cell inside there that is still made today, which they said probably would be, you could swap them and get it. I don't know. That's the two situations I've run into, is where I haven't done enough research, bought something, and then I'm like, wow, I'm way over my head. Is the battery situation, like, is there anything available? Is it hard to find the charger? Like sometimes it's easy to find the battery, but impossible to find the charger. Or like, and then the other situation is like memory card formats. So sometimes, so thankfully with the DCS 760, I just use a PCMCIA to CF card adapter, which works great, which is awesome.
Same
but yeah, I've run into weird situations where I can't remember. There's a camera I'm working on right now. Oh, I have two cameras that have internal hard drives. So the only way to get them off is through like a serial cable. But then I'm like trying to like get these modern drivers to connect to this old serial cable through USB. It's like,
oh, that's like, rough.
Man, so I got a cool camera that works, but I can't get the photos off.
What happened with me with the Kodak, it was advertised on the same auction site that I bought the D1 as like this old Kodak camera probably doesn't work, right? So it came in with a really low bid. Not many people were interested in it. And I ended up winning it. And I was like, wow, that was lucky. But they were advertising it purely as, you should just buy this if you need a replacement viewfinder for the Nikon F5.
Oh, yeah.
That's literally how they were selling it. And I was like, So I kind of like probed the guy saying like, you know, why is it that you can't test it? You know, because this was like I think it was an auction site in Stockholm, and they sell through this web portal called Tradera in Sweden. So I just emailed the guy and said like, what is it? Like, why isn't it working? And he said, oh, we don't have the right PCMCIA adapter to be able to put it in there. Like, we have the battery, we have the charger, we have the DC charger. And I'm like, oh, he's got everything.
Yeah.
He just can't put the thing in. And I was like, there's a good chance that this might be absolutely fine.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was.
That's awesome.
The other one that happened to me was, I'll try and get the number right, the Minolta. You can just about see it there. Minolta RD.
Oh, yeah. That's a camera that, I've always been interested in that one.
Oh, so you haven't tried that one yet?
No, so I have the RD3000, which came later, and different mount. That's it doesn't use the Minolta A mount. It uses the Vectis mount, but yeah, never tried though.
Interesting. So that one was really difficult to get working. Mm-hmm. Battery situation was fine. It came with 3. They all charged fine. That shocked me since it's from 19. But the memory situation is not so easy. So like the Kodak, it uses PCMCIA because I had the adapter for CF. I thought this will be fine. But you can't format the cards in the camera. You have to format them connected to a PC. And we're talking PCs from 1995.
Yeah.
So that's when it starts to get really, really complicated.
Yeah.
So I started Googling it, and I found a guy who was still using one. I think, I can't remember the name of the guy, but he was running this kind of like online camera museum, and he had it listed. And I reached out to him for help on what to do with this memory card. And he's like, oh, I've got the camera here. I can send you some of the formatted SD cards, CF cards.
Yeah.
And yeah, it just worked. But it's like, I would not have been able to get that thing
to do that unless
without the help of some random guy in Germany.
Yeah. That one's cool because the RD175, I think, is that the one that has 3 sensors in it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Individual colors. Yeah.
And then it has the, and then uses Minolta A mount, which is so cool. And then does it have a huge crop factor, or does it do what it does? Okay.
It's a 2 times. And I think it also has an impact on the f-stop. So not just from an aperture perspective because it's 2 times, but because of
because the RD3000 does something kind of similar where it has these like magnifiers in it and stuff that actually reduce the crop factor. But
right.
Because of that, the widest aperture you can have is like 7.
That's it.
Or something.
So it's the same thing, but you get a 2 times crop as well.
Yeah.
So it's rough to use. Like my 35 to 70 on there is like 70 to 140.
Yeah,
and it's that's kind of difficult
hard,
to use.
Yeah. There's a adapter out there that I kind of want to buy just because it'd be just cool to show on the channel, but it's like one of those ridiculous purchases that doesn't make any sense. But it's like $280 an autofocus adapter to get Minolta Vectus lenses onto a Sony E mount. And people do this. There's people online that have bought it and use it. But the lenses are just not, I'm not convinced that the Vectus lenses are that good. So I don't know. I'm still up in the air. I think it'd be cool to show, but it's like complete waste of money. But it would just be so cool to do it. But that's just so, it's just so interesting to me that Minolta, when they did that, they didn't just make a follow-up to the 175 where it still used the excellent Minolta A mount lenses and instead went with these like kind of crappy consumer level Vectus lenses.
Yeah, that's an interesting choice.
Except for this adapter, you can't use them on anything else. They don't have manual focus or manual aperture or anything, so you can't manually adapt them to things.
Ooh, tricky.
I mean, you can, but you just are like limited to whatever they're focused on. That's the advantage of having a YouTube channel, is that I've been able to buy really dumb stuff, and because the videos make money, it kind of like pays for it. So, and that's kind of like what I wanted to do back when I was getting into older cameras. I kind of wanted that kind of freedom from someone on the internet, and now there's lots of people who do it, but where you could get into some of these older cameras that would not necessarily like financially make sense for any like individual to ever do, like to buy this, like it'd just be odd for them to spend that much money on a camera that's clearly not that good. But I knew that people who had YouTube channels were able to make money, and then that kind of like, it's just this cool cycle of the internet today where you can offer free content so no one has to pay for it, but then in turn it pays for then this thing that you're doing, this hobby that you're doing or whatever. Maybe because of that, I would do that, because I think otherwise it logically makes no sense to buy that adapter. So on your website, it's really interesting to me because I first came there because of that review, and you have a lot of interesting old camera reviews and some modern ones. But then also have some really good tutorials in what seems to me like very different aspects of photography. So one is infrared, which I share interest in. I like infrared. Wildlife, also interested in that, but very different. And then also maybe we can talk about your bokeh panoramas, because you have a lot of those and it's just a cool technique in photography. So I'd be curious like why you're so into that. But yeah, you can talk about infrared first if you like.
I mean, I've been interested in infrared since I went to like a photographic holiday in the Lake District, run by this guy called John Gravitt, and he introduced me to infrared. I think back then he was using, was it film or digital? It was digital, I think. It was like a D100, I think, something like that. And he just had an infrared filter that he put in front of it, and everything's set up on a tripod, because, non-converted cameras, you kind of need to set it up first and then put the filter on and then shoot and then play with the settings a little bit until you can see something on the screen. Yeah. Still much easier than doing on film, but it's still faffy compared to like today. So that got me interested in it. I just loved the visual aesthetic of infrared. So at the time it was all pure black and white infrared. Over the years, I kind of progressed into more sort of like color and all the processing that you can do with color infrared. Or different filters like the IR Chrome, for example. But at the time, it was just that sort of ethereal quality that you get from like trees being super white, water being super black, sky being super black, and people being sort of like very sort of porcelain texture. So I got myself a converted camera a few years later, just a little compact. I think it was a Canon G9 or something. Absolutely loved it. And then eventually upgraded that to a DSLR, loved it. And then I had a bunch of cameras. This was like, I had like 5 or 6 cameras, not like the tons that we have today. And I sold everything because I wanted, at the time, I wanted full frame and I wanted infrared, but I wanted it to be full spectrum. So the Sony A7, the original one, had just come out. And I decided to, I think I had a Nikon D3 at the time, amazing camera, which I've since bought again. And so I had full frame, but I wanted to have something smaller. So the D3 was, I'd had it for like 7 or 8 years at the time. And it was great, but it was super heavy. And I was like, Sony A7 is like half the weight or less, still full frame. But the great thing about mirrorless is that once you convert it to infrared, you have so few of the issues that you had
Right.
with DSLR conversions of infrared. Whether you convert it to color infrared like 590 nanometers, or whether it's pure black and white like 720, 50, that kind of thing.
Which, for people that aren't familiar with infrared, what are some of those issues that can come up on DSLRs versus mirrorless with?
So the first one you probably come across is that there's a focus offset. On many lenses, it's more common on older lenses. You will actually see like a little red dot on the focus sort of distance meter. So in theory, you can kind of set your camera up. You can even autofocus it, and then just kind of offset it with how much the little red dot is away. And that's not too bad, but you're doing everything blind at that point. So it's a little bit tricky because you can't see it. That's the other thing, because if you convert a DSLR to full spectrum, there's nothing wrong with you being able to do that. But as soon as you put the filter on front of the lens, you then lose the ability to use your viewfinder again.
Right.
But with mirrorless, as you know, you can just keep using your electronic viewfinder or your rear screen of the wavelengths. The exposure times are pretty normal. So you don't have to put it on a tripod anymore like you used to with a non-converted camera. I had no idea about most of this stuff going into buying the A7. I had this great plan because I didn't have a lot of money. I sold all the other cameras and I could just about afford the A7 and the conversion, but only if I bought a gray market one. But I thought, well, since I'm converting it, I'm going to lose my warranty anyway.
Yeah, sure.
So I'll just buy a gray market and then send it off to the conversion company. But I was still really dubious about, like, is this a good idea? Because I had seen so few people doing this. This was back in like 2014, I think it was. The A7 was out, and I didn't know how good it was going to be. It was just amazing. Everything just worked. I mean, there are some negatives I should point out for anyone who's thinking like, I'm just going to go and convert my mirrorless camera to full spectrum. Everything's going to be fine. The big problems that you do come across are you're going to need filters for everything, which is kind of expensive unless you're going to do step-up rings. Mm-hmm. You can get internal filters now, which is not too bad, but they kind of have their own image quality issues. So there's lots of pros and cons. It's going to cost you a lot of money to do still, but the freedom that it gives you is amazing. The fact that you can pick any wavelength, you can pick like tri-band filters that do parts of each wavelength. That's what the IR Chrome does, and it's a bit of a trade secret as to what those wavelengths are because they don't want people, making their own. They're kind of expensive, the IR Chromes.
Yeah, I have one. I have heard that there's some people have kind of guessed at it, and they're like, oh, you stack like a 580 nanometer with a yellow filter, and I've never tried any of that, but
no,
to try to get close. But it is expensive, but I just bought it because it does work well.
It does. I would recommend anybody, like, yeah, they're a bit expensive, but just get one. If you can do that for like one of your favorite lenses, or you don't mind converting up or down with step-up rings, I guess step-up rings will work better, then yeah, I'd highly recommend it. I have bought another one from another company sort of doing their version of it. It was called the Crimson. And the colors were completely different. Oh, it wasn't bad in any way,
just different,
but they were just different. So yeah, the freedom of that, I felt that like revitalized my photography. I was kind of a little bit bored of photography in general at the time. Then being able to shoot infrared so easily revitalized it. But I also found that because you can switch between visible light and infrared multiple spectrums, that it also enabled me to shoot in many more times of the day. So like with visible photography, it's really nice to do in the morning and in the evening, but infrared is kind of good in the middle of the day. So it kind of bridges that gap between photography being more useful more of the time. That's really nice.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I was just thinking that the other day. I was searching behind me to find, I have like a little Sony V1 I'm playing with. Doing some infrared stuff with, and it has its own set of frustrations, but it's so fun to have that with another camera because exactly what you said. So different times of the day become really interesting. Also, like sometimes like a Yeah, just like a bright blue sky isn't exactly what you're looking for. Yeah, midday sun, but that looks excellent on infrared. That looks so cool because the sky turns out so dark. And then it's just, I was thinking about it. It's really fun to like revisit places where you've been to like 100 times and you're like
Yeah.
so done taking pictures of the same things. But if you show up with an infrared camera, it's like a whole new, you just get like totally all this inspiration comes. Everything looks so different. It's so exciting. So yeah, I think it's cool, especially if you can pick up a really cheap one. There's some cheap options out there.
Yeah. And I found the same thing as well for the different wavelengths. So like when
Yeah,
I
yeah.
had just a red filter, which is super cheap, right? You can just buy them on eBay for like $5 for pretty much anything. Like I really love the aesthetic of that one. It's about 590 nanometers for a what is it, Hoya R25A, and that just gives you a really nice like dual tone color that you can process by flipping the blue and the red channel. Like that is super nice. But then the IR Chrome is very different. It's strange. Like it gives you that like red foliage without having to do a color swap.
Mm-hmm.
But it also gives you other colors as well. Like I love how like if something is green or blue or whatever, and it doesn't have any infrared reflectivity, it kind of picks up on that anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But you can still be in like a forest scene and all the trees will be red, all the grass will be red, the sky will be blue, and it kind of almost then goes kind of back to being a bit more like a Hoya red filter.
Mm-hmm.
I shouldn't use brand names. It doesn't matter what red filter you use. But yeah, so infrared was a huge passion for me. As much as I like to dabble in all the different wavelengths, black and white infrared was still my favorite.
Yeah.
Just the sort of pure aesthetic that you get from that. And then I hit another wall because I was finding a lot of my lenses were creating hotspots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I was getting very frustrated with it. I was using Kalari's database, which is, I don't know if you know it, but
I've seen it. Yeah, I've used it.
basically anybody can go there and report on a lens and say this is good, this is bad, but most people don't know what to look for. So they'll take a couple of pictures, they won't have any hotspot, they'll go, yeah, it's great, and then I'll go and buy a lens and it'll suck. And I'm like, oh, that's so annoying. So I got very frustrated with that after a while, that I ended up making my own infrared lens database. And I ended up testing like about 150 lenses.
Oh, wow.
Various different mounts, all tested on the Sony, so it was all adapted.
Yeah.
And I made like a scoring system for it, and I've had a lot of people interested and sort of like very appreciative of the results because they seem to be able to replicate them, which is great. And that sort of like got me to a point where I had a bunch of lenses that I really loved, but then I wasn't really interested in continuing to do the testing.
Mm-hmm.
The really hard thing to find is wide angle lenses. Modern lenses are generally worse because of the advanced coatings they have. They don't play nice with infrared. They tend to reflect it. So what happens is some light comes in the lens and then it kind of gets reflected off the sensor and then reflected back off the coating. And then it just kind of gets this infinite loop and you get these big bright spots of undesirable lighting. It doesn't have to be a spot. This is the other thing that I kind of ran into problems with people doing their own tests and stuff, is that I determine any kind of light pollution in the frame as a hotspot. Whereas some people will say, that's a ghost and this is a spot and this is, and I'm like, I don't care. It's messing up my image.
All of it I don't want.
No, it's all undesirable. Yeah. So I found a bunch of lenses that I really liked, and they're all really old. There's certain old mounts that are really good. Like the best one I found was old Nikon F lenses that are pre-AI. They're actually labeled as F, but that's not the mount, that's the range. So they're and you can spot them by the fact that they have a metal focus ring. So those are the F series, and they have been the most friendly for me on infrared hotspot. So they get the sort of like cleanest results, the kind of inkiest blacks and the less sort of reflected unwanted light. And the reason why I go on about this, right, is I was reading an article about the new Dune 2 movie.
Oh, yeah.
Have you seen it?
No, don't spoil it. I do plan
okay,
to.
I won't spoil it, but there is a scene in there, really going to not spoil it, I promise, that is shot in infrared.
Oh, cool.
So it's on Arrakis, and they've done basically the whole scene. And there's obviously they've gone down the path of like choosing a bunch of good lenses for it. And I was curious what they used, but then I read an article on Petapixel saying the filming department used a bunch of super old Soviet lenses to film, but they never mentioned that the Soviet lenses were for infrared. And I immediately went, I bet that was for the infrared.
They were, yeah. So they weren't the modern. Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's just my guess, but it kind of lines up with all the tests that I've done. And there's some super interesting articles talking about the infrared. Like they had to like redo all the wardrobe because a lot of materials in infrared, even if they're black, will come out white.
Yeah.
As an infrared photographer, you just know these things, right? Yeah. But they kind of discovered this and realized that they had to basically go out and find different materials to put people in.
Wow.
And not just for the clothing, but for the sets.
Yeah.
But the thing that really surprises me, like watching the movie, because I saw a short clip before I went to see the movie, when I was actually watching the scene, the thing I'm most impressed with is the prosthetics on the people. Because I'm thinking, like, you know, what happens with people when you shoot them in infrared is they tend to look really porcelain because the light goes deeper into the skin and you get much more subsurface scattering. How they've managed to do that with the prosthetics, I don't know. But it's really impressive.
That's cool. Thanks for telling me. I missed that, and now I'm going to really appreciate it when I see it.
You're going to be looking out for it now.
Yeah, I will. That is super cool. So then, and you still do infrared stuff right now?
I do, but nowhere near as much as I wish I did. It's kind of like fallen behind a lot for me. And most of that is my obsession with wildlife, specifically squirrels. Yeah. That ended up being my sort of release while we were in COVID. I got really into doing squirrel photography, and it's just kind of continued. Now I just feed them. I just don't take pictures of them.
Yeah, I've felt that too before, but I think it is really important, especially just always like check yourself and be like, okay, this is like my creative expression. This is my hobby. This is my relaxation. Like I should never feel guilty that, because I've had that happen with cameras before. I'm like, man, I've loved this camera for years. Why do I not like it anymore? Like, just sell it, just move on. That's fine. There's nothing or keep it. I mean, we'll do whatever you want to do, but I just mean, yeah, anytime you feel that, there's like no reason to feel like you need to hang on to something or if it is with something creatively, like I'm going to stick a back burner on infrared, and then you'll come back and feel refreshed later and it'll be cool again and feel inspired again or whatever.
Yeah. Like I say before, like there's no greater sort of like motivation refresher than infrared for me. Maybe other people would be different, but if anyone's in a creative lull and they haven't tried infrared, if you can do it cheaply, a lot of cameras can just have an infrared filter mounted on the lens and work.
That's probably the best way to start. Sure. And then just know you need a tripod usually for that setup to work. A lot of, you can just Google it too. People will tell you, but there are a lot of older cameras that have particularly weak IR cut filters on the sensors.
What a perfect segue to go back into old camera talk. Yeah, older cameras are just way better. Like you say, because they have weaker IR blockers on the sensors. The Fuji X1, I used to be able to get usable handheld shots out of that with no conversion.
Yeah, I've done that with, it was a Samsung TL500, a little handheld camera. Was the same thing. I could get handheld shot. If it was a bright day, I could get handheld shots. Yeah, that had stabilization too, so that helped.
That's good. Yeah, the Fuji didn't have back then.
Yeah. So there's some good stuff. And then also, you'd be surprised too. I mean, you wouldn't, but people listening to this, but you can get look at the early Sony NEXs. So those are like 12, 14, 16 megapixel cameras. A lot of people have converted those, and I see those sell converted full spectrum for like $100. And those are cool because you have the same ability then to just mount whatever, just adapt whatever you want to it.
I would definitely advise looking for already converted ones because they tend not to be able to get very much money on the secondhand market.
Right.
I've sold old converted cameras and they go for very little money usually. But that's also another interesting thing, old pre-converted Sony's good idea. Non-converted Sony's generally not a good idea because their infrared blocking is usually 100%.
Gotcha.
I've had that experience on the Sony A7 Mark I, Mark II, A9. I haven't tried it on the A1. I'm sure it's the same. I think it's just got to a point where their filters are so tuned for visible light that they just don't let anything else in.
Yeah.
But not all camera companies are like that. Like you can still buy I'm going to guess here and say a modern Nikon, and it should still be okay. I actually don't know that. I say the best thing to do is to Google it.
Yeah, and see if anyone's tried. Yeah, I don't really own any modern. What is the newest camera? I guess I do own the Pixie camera is the newest camera I own. Then I'd have to think about it. I don't own many new cameras right now.
I tried the Samsung NX500. That didn't work as well.
Oh,
completely
that was a great review, by the way. So,
thank you.
Ed on his website, I'll plug his website again. His kind of like a blog website, has a bunch of really cool stuff on it. So in there, you could learn more about the infrared stuff that we've been talking about and see some really in-depth articles on those sorts of things. And then also any of these cameras that we've been talking about, I think you posted on. But NX500, that was a recent one, right? That you reviewed.
Yeah, it was. I got interested in that because I saw some people talking about Samsung, and I know they've been discontinued several years ago. And the NX500 was one of the ones that people talked about a lot. You know, they really liked it because it had a lot of the tech from the NX1, the flagship, but it was a much smaller camera. That alone interested me. For a long time, it's held its price really well, and in a lot of places it still does. But I was lucky enough to get that one for a pretty good price, and was just blown away. And it just made me like, oh my God, I wish Samsung was still making cameras.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Yeah. So what's like a summary recap of like, what are your favorite things about it?
How small it is, how sort of powerful the features it has. A lot of the features I really like about it are enabled by a firmware mod. But the fact that it has that enabled, I think you know more about like why that's possible than I do.
I don't know specific. I did remember seeing that, but I read your article a little while ago, so I can't remember specifically what features you're talking about. But was it the focus bracketing?
Yeah, focus bracketing and the electronic shutter. So it's labeled as having an electronic shutter out of the box, but it's actually just EFCS, the electronic first curtain sync. So it still makes a noise. But for some reason, it's actually fully capable of doing fully electronic shutter, but it was just never shipped that way.
Yeah.
And that just blows my mind.
Yeah.
Like,
it is interesting. Yeah. There's probably a lot of cameras that fall under that. Because I know another big one, we talked about CHDK for like Canon point and shoots and stuff, which let you do. Like, for instance, otherwise, this Canon point and shoot I had could only do a shutter speed of, I don't remember how much. And you couldn't change it. It was all automatic. But with the hack thing, you could change the shutter speed much faster, and I could freeze like raindrops coming down from off of it, you know. So it was so cool creatively, but just funny that it didn't like it had the ability to do that, just it didn't. But there's also what is it called? The Magic Lantern, I think. People use that as well for Blackmagic or Canon cameras. I can't remember. But same sort of thing where it's like they can take a camera that was shipped as 1080p and it can actually shoot 4K, but you just, they have to, I don't know. That's cool though. Good on people that figure that out.
I think the NX500 could shoot 4K anyway, but it has a whole bunch of improved video specs.
Oh, cool.
I think it allows you to shoot 2 as well. I haven't done too much with that, but yeah, very, very interesting that you can do that on a camera that you can now buy for, well, I mean, it depends a bit, but I got mine for like under $200, I think it was.
Yeah, that's really cool.
But yeah, once it had the electronic shutter, like I was taking pictures of like mice and stuff with it. There's no way I would have gotten away with that with the EFCS. Focus bracketing is awesome, but the mod does show its limitations in places. Like it's a little bit buggy. Like it lets you say however many shots you want for your focus bracketing. So you can say 1,000, but it actually only does 100. So if you say 200, it does the first half.
Gotcha.
And I've not found any way around that. It seems to be an inherent bug.
So maybe a good camera for someone who wants to tinker a little bit. And then but the lenses look pretty good. The lens quality.
And the lenses you can also pick up like really cheap if you shop around. Obviously, you know, secondhand these days, but the 85 1.4 was a little bit on the heavy side, but amazing image quality, and I picked up that pretty cheap. And then the 60mm macro, which I used to do the focus stacking, was really, really nice. I mean, the sensor on the NX500 is like 28 megapixels, so it's like higher than I was getting on my old Sony A7. I would also say the image quality is probably a bit better than the original Sony A7 as well. So it's a good camera. I mean, it was came out in 2015. I think it was discontinued in 2015, and then Samsung was dead. Real shame.
I had the I actually just sold it. I had the Galaxy one with the ran Android. There's a couple of versions that ran Android, but I think this is the only interchangeable lens one that ran Android. Like some cameras run Android behind the scenes, but I mean like full on load apps, do things like you could check your email. I watched YouTube on it. It was very weird. but what I found, I'm curious if the NX500 does this too, was the manual focus experience was actually pretty good on it. So there was no problems mounting a manual lens. I just bought a manual adapter, put M42 lenses on it. And I don't remember if there was focus peaking, but I think there was punch and zoom. And then there's just no problem shooting with, like it metered fine, it whatever. Some of these other cameras that we weren't really thinking about that back then can have issues, but it was a good experience.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't experienced any sort of exposure issues with any of them. I never really thought about that, to be honest with you, because Sonys are quite well set up for that, and that's mostly what I've used for shooting manual.
Yeah.
But yeah, it had peaking. The focus zooming also worked, but the only thing that was annoying was that it would only ever go to the center. You couldn't then move that around anywhere. So when I was doing the focus stacking, you kind of want to see your near focus point and your end focus point, and those are usually in very different places.
Right.
And so I literally had to just leave the tripod kind of loose so that I could focus on one position and focus on another, and hope that was kind of
that was probably
not messing it up too much.
Yeah.
So that was like super frustrating. But then you can't complain at that because it never shipped with focus stacking. So
yeah, right. That's true.
Yeah. But that's probably the most exciting old camera that I've bought. Lens is really, really good. Camera is really, really good. I've only used the NX500 of all the Samsungs, so I can't say much about the rest of them.
Yeah.
But I also used it to shoot bokeh panos. Maybe this is a good segue for that.
Yeah, let's talk about that for people who don't know what that is. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I've heard it under different names. But so this is the idea where you would zoom in to get just like an insane depth of field, or go in closer, like whatever. Then you would want to use manual focus. So you're just preset on your focus point, wherever that is. And then you're taking basically a panorama. But I guess the end result is that it looks like you're shooting at like this insane aperture that doesn't exist and focal point that doesn't exist, because you take this panorama and a lot of it is just out of focus, but your subject's in focus. And so you could do it with people, or I've done it with a tree before.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially it. You're using usually longer focal length lenses, and it usually works better with primes. So the key to the effect is using a lens with the largest entrance pupil that you can find. So that's usually longer focal length lenses that are still quite fast, like an 85 1.4, or the one I use most of the time at the moment is 135 1.8. So that gets you an entrance pupil of 75 millimeters. Then once you do the panorama, you end up with, say, 24 millimeters. You're ending up with a 24 millimeter wide angle lens, or image, I should say, but with an effective entrance pupil of 75 millimeters. So that ends up making your f-stop effectively 0, whatever the math ends up being, 24 by 75.
Gotcha, yeah.
So yeah, you're ending up getting these. They're impossible because wide angle lenses are never able to be that fast. I mean, even a 24 1.4, which is going to cost you quite a lot of money, it's not going to give you particularly shallow depth of field unless you're focusing really, really close.
Right. And then you would get like insane distortion. So if you're taking a portrait of someone, their nose is going to be, you're going to be like right in front of them. So yeah, it has this, it's, you can check out his site or just Google it as well and see, but the pictures look, you can tell that like at first you're like, something is really like different about this. Like, what is going on? Like, this doesn't seem possible.
A lot of people say that it looks a little bit like a tilt shift effect.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, they tend to be a little bit more on the extreme side. Like with bokeh panos, you can't ever shoot something that's really far away and still have a shallow depth of field. So in that regard, a tilt shift lens is your only option. But the tilt shift effect is kind of the effect you're getting, because if I'm shooting like a car or a train or something like that, it's giving you a shallow depth of field which you normally wouldn't be able to have. And so people tend to think tilt shift. But tilt shift is not actually, limiting your depth of field.
Right.
It's just arbitrarily blurring the top and bottom of your frame, and only really works if you're kind of looking down on the subject.
Mm-hmm.
So it gives you an effect that you can't really get any other way. Well, other than large format photography, of course, there are some large format cameras that have some like aerial optics on them, like I don't know if you know the Kodak Ektar lens.
Mm.
It's a crazy big lens that was basically used in aircraft to make images, but it's the front optic is like it's absolutely huge. But if you buy one of those lenses, and you can still buy them, and you put it on a large format camera, it's going to cost you like thousands.
Right.
It's going to weigh like 8 kilograms or something like that. You're not going to want to carry it around. Bokeh panos, I mean, the equipment doesn't weigh very much usually. I mean, a little mirrorless camera with an 85 1.4 is usually going to be like 1.5 kilos or something like that.
Cool. Yeah, I encourage anyone. That's a cool thing to bring up, because it's probably free. Like, you might not have the best stuff for it right off the bat, but even just experiment with what you have and you're going to be pretty amazed.
Yes. So, I mean, obviously some lenses like 85 1.4s and 135 1.8s are expensive, right? But you can get effects with lenses that are not very expensive. Like an 85 1.8, for example, will still get you a very, very respectful result. And they can be picked up, especially vintage ones. And vintage lenses for bokeh panos, I feel, work even better. So yeah, you can get extremely impressive results on a very small budget.
Thank you so much, Ed, for talking with us and sharing all these cool stories and cameras and ideas with us. I'm sure everyone appreciates it. I appreciate it. And you can check out his website at edwardnoble.com. I'll put the link in the show notes. Definitely check that out. And then maybe we'll see you in the comments too. I guess you're probably there sometimes.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of Happy Snappin'. I hope you found this discussion insightful. I have many more episodes in the works with creative and interesting photographers, so subscribe if you want to see more of those. I'd also love to hear your comments and thoughts about this episode and any general questions you may have or suggestions for future episodes, so please leave those. You'll find more information about this podcast along with a forum for like-minded photographers and more at www.snappiness.space. All right, go out there and take pictures wherever you are and with whatever gear you have. And until next time, happy snapping.